If you're studying A-level psychology, subscribe. I'm covering the essential topics across AQA, Edexcel, and OCR on this channel. In 1951, a British psychiatrist published a report for the World Health Organization that would change the way governments, hospitals, schools, and families thought about childhood for the next 70 years. His name was John Bowlby, and his central claim was both simple and radical. What happens to a child in the first 2.5 years of life? Specifically, whether they form a close, warm, continuous bond with a primary caregiver determines the trajectory of their intellectual, emotional, and social development. Not influences it, not contributes to it, but determines it. And if that bond is broken or never properly formed, the damage, Bowlby argued, may be permanent and irreversible. That is an extraordinary claim, and like all extraordinary claims in psychology, it generated extraordinary debate. So welcome back to A-Level Psychology Decoded. This is video 5, and we're staying in attachment, building directly on the last video's coverage of Ainsworth. If you haven't watched that video yet, I strongly recommend going back to it first, because the connection between Ainsworth's types of attachment and Bowlby's internal working model is one of the most important conceptual links in this entire topic. So here we're covering Bowlby's monotropic theory and the maternal deprivation hypothesis, the theoretical foundation of everything Ainsworth was trying to measure. By the end, you will know the 4 core claims of the theory, the 44 juvenile Thieves study in precise detail, the critical deprivation versus privation distinction, and the evaluation arguments that will score you marks on any exam board. So let's get into it. Who was Bowlby? John Bowlby was born in London in 1907 into an upper middle class family where, as was typical for the time and class, he saw relatively little of his parents. He was raised primarily by a nanny and lost her when he was about 4 years old, an experience he later described as having a formative impact on his thinking about separation and loss. He trained as a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist. It was his early clinical work that first directed his attention toward the relationship between early experience and later development. Working at the London Child Guidance Clinic, he encountered large numbers of emotionally disturbed and delinquent children. What struck him repeatedly was the pattern. A disproportionate number of these children had experienced significant disruption or loss in their early relationships. This was not yet a theory, it was a clinical observation, but it was a powerful one. The World Health Organization in 1950 commissioned Bowlby to prepare a report on the mental health of homeless and institutionalized children in post-war Europe. The context matters here. After World War II, there were hundreds of thousands of orphaned and displaced children all across Europe, many of whom had been raised in institutions with minimal personal care. Their developmental outcomes were often poor, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. But why? Bowlby's report, published in 1951 as Maternal Care and Mental Health, argued that the common thread was the absence of a close, continuous bond with a mother figure early in life. And this report became the foundation for his wider theoretical work. Before the WHO report, Bowlby had already conducted the study that would provide the empirical foundation for his theory, the 44 Juvenile Thieves study, and that's what we cover in a later slide in detail. This study gave him the data to support what his clinical observations had been suggesting, that early maternal separation was linked to serious psychological and behavioural problems in adolescence. A fun fact, Bowlby is sometimes characterised as simply arguing that mothers should stay at home and not go to work. And that's a significant oversimplification of his position that became politically charged and remains contested. What Bowlby actually argued was that infants need a warm, continuous relationship with a primary caregiver. He didn't necessarily specify that this had to be the biological mother or that it had to be a woman. His original claims were more nuanced than the popular version suggests, though his language often did focus heavily on the mother, which later critics, including Michael Rutter, took issue with. Well, let's have a look at the monotropic theory. The core claims. There are 4 propositions here. Bowlby's monotropic theory rests on these 4 interconnected claims. And here, I lay them out clearly, and you need to know all 4 with precision. Claim 1, monotropy. Infants are biologically driven to form one primary attachment that is qualitatively more important than all the others. The word monotropy comes from the Greek mono, meaning one, and tropos, meaning turning toward. The infant turns toward one specific figure above all others. And this doesn't mean that infants cannot form multiple attachments. Bowlby acknowledged they can and they do. But he argued there is a hierarchy, with one primary figure at the top whose role is irreplaceable. And this primary figure, usually but not necessarily the mother, provides the foundation for the internal working model. And this claim is directly challenged by later research, which we cover in a later slide. So hold this thought. Claim 2 is the critical period. Attachment should form from birth to approximately 2.5 years of age. During this window, the infant is biologically primed to form the primary attachment bond. If attachment doesn't form during this period, or if the bond formed is disrupted, the consequences for development may be serious and potentially irreversible. Now, the word critical is important here. A critical period is a biologically determined window during which development must occur, or it will not occur at all. This is different from a sensitive period, which is a window during which development occurs most easily, but can still occur outside of it. Now, Bowlby used the language of a critical period here. And later theorists, including Rutter, argued that the evidence better supports a sensitive period. And this distinction is a key evaluative exam point. Claim 3, the internal working model. The first attachment becomes a mental template, a cognitive representation of the self, the caregiver, and how relationships work. And this is the internal working model. And we cover this in more detail on the next slide. And the 4th claim, maternal deprivation. Prolonged separation from or loss of the primary attachment figure during the critical period could cause lasting intellectual, social, and emotional harm. This is the most controversial and most contested of the 4 claims, and it's the one that generates the most debate. So let's turn to the internal working model, which is one of Bowlby's most enduring and most influential contributions to psychology. And it's one that connects directly to what you learned about regarding Ainsworth in the last video. Now here, I'm defining it precisely. The internal working model is a mental representation of 3 things simultaneously: the self, the caregiver, and the relationship between them. And it's built through repeated early attachment experiences, and it operates as a template, guiding the individual's expectations, interpretations, and behaviors in all subsequent relationships. Now think of it this way. Through thousands of interactions with their primary caregiver in the first months of life, an infant is building up a picture of how relationships work. Does the caregiver respond when I need them? Am I worthy of care and comfort? Are other people reliable and trustworthy? Are relationships safe? And the answers to these questions, derived from the infant's actual lived experience of their caregiver's behaviour, get encoded into the internal working model. And here I distinguish two broad types clearly: secure versus insecure. So an secure internal model develops when the care has been reliable, warm, and sensitive. The child learns, through experience, not through being told, that they are worthy of love, that others can be trusted, and that relationships are a source of comfort rather than anxiety. And this positive template carries forward into friendships, romantic relationships, and eventually into their own parenting. Then you have the insecure internal working model, and that develops when care has been inconsistent, rejecting, or unavailable. The child may learn that they are not worthy of love, that others cannot be relied on, or that seeking closeness leads to rejection or disappointment. And this negative template predicts difficulties in later relationships, the mistrust, anxiety, and avoidance that characterize adult insecure attachment. So there's the continuity hypothesis then. And this is the specific prediction that follows from the internal working model. It states that early attachment patterns are expected to predict the quality of later relationships. Friendships in childhood, romantic partnerships in adolescence and adulthood, and the quality of parenting in the next generation. Now, this is a powerful and testable claim. Research has provided some support. Securely, attachment infants do tend to show more positive social relationships in later childhood. But the evidence isn't deterministic. The internal working model can be updated and revised in response to later significant relationships. So a child who is insecurely attached can form a secure attachment to a subsequent sensitive caregiver. And this is important both clinically and as an evaluation point in your essays. Now here's the link to the previous video with Ainsworth. It's direct and it's important. Ainsworth's 3 attachment types, secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant, can be understood as 3 different types of internal working model. The secure infant has developed a model of the caregiver as reliable and the self as worthy. The avoidant infant has developed a model of the caregiver as unresponsive and of attachment behaviour as futile. The resistant infant has developed a model of the caregiver as unpredictable and of the self as needing to maximise distress signals to ensure attention. Ainsworth gave us a way to measure what Bowlby had theorised. I'll say that again. Ainsworth has given us a way to measure what Bowlby has theorised. So here's the evidence base. The 44 Juvenile Thieves study. This is Bowlby's primary piece of research, of his empirical evidence for the maternal deprivation hypothesis, and you need to know it in precise methodological detail. The aim of this study was to investigate whether early separation from the mother was linked to delinquency and emotional problems, and specifically in adolescence. Now, Bowlby wanted to test whether a pattern of early maternal deprivation could be identified in the backgrounds of young people who had gone on to develop serious behavioural and emotional difficulties. The procedure and the sample base, well, Bowlby studied 88 adolescents that were referred to his London Child Guidance Clinic. 44 of them had been referred for stealing, and these were the juvenile thieves. The other 44 had been referred for emotional disturbance, but they had no history of criminal behaviour, and these were the control group. Now, Bowlby conducted detailed interviews with the young people and their families, collecting information about their early life histories, any periods of separation from their mothers, and their current emotional functioning. So what was the key finding? Well, the headline result is the one that you need to really remember. 86% of those diagnosed with affectionless psychopathy had experienced early maternal deprivation, compared with none of the control group. And that's a striking statistical contrast. But you should also know the broader findings. 14 of the 44 thieves, approximately a third, were diagnosed with affectionless psychopathy. And of the full sample of 44 thieves, 17 had experienced prolonged separation from their mother before the age of 5, compared with only 2 in the control group. So affectionless psychopathy is the term that Bowlby is using here to describe a specific cluster of characteristics. A lack of guilt or remorse, weak or absent empathy, and limited capacity for genuine affection toward others. He argued this was the most severe consequence of early maternal deprivation, an inability to form meaningful emotional bonds as a result of never having formed one in the critical first years of life. And this concept connects directly to the internal working model. An infant who never forms a primary attachment has no template for warm, reciprocal relationships. The model predicts that this deficit will manifest in exactly the kind of shallow, guilt-free interpersonal functioning that characterizes affectionless psychopathy. Now, the data collection relied heavily on retrospective self-report, and this is an important methodological note for your evaluation. It asked participants and their families to recall events from early childhood, sometimes many years previously. And this introduces the possibility of recall bias. Memories of early life are unreliable and may be unconsciously reconstituted. Bowlby himself was conducting the assessments, and that introduces potential researcher bias. He knew which group participants were in, and this may have influenced his judgments. And these are significant methodological limitations, and they come up a little bit later when we evaluate this. So let's look at the maternal deprivation hypothesis of his core claim. Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis is the most controversial and the most contested element of the entire theoretical framework, so let me state it clearly. Bowlby claimed that losing or being separated from the primary attachment figure during the critical period could lead to permanent, largely irreversible damage to intellectual, social, and emotional development. So let's look at the critical distinction between deprivation and privation. Here, I make the most important distinction in the entire topic, and it's one that often students will confuse constantly. So you need to know this clearly. Deprivation means that the infant formed an attachment bond and then lost it. Through separation, through death, through hospitalization, or any other form of loss. The bond existed and then it got broken. Privation means that the infant never formed an attachment bond at all. They were deprived of the opportunity to form one in the first place. So the bond never existed. And these are fundamentally different experiences with potentially different consequences. Bowlby's hypothesis was primarily about deprivation, the loss of an existing bond. Rutter later argued that much of the evidence Bowlby cited actually reflected privation rather than deprivation, and that privation may have more severe and less reversible consequences. So here's the simplest way to remember it. Deprivation, had it, lost it. Privation, never had it at all. I'll say that again. Deprivation, you had it, then you lost it. Privation, you never had it at all. Now, James Robertson and his wife Joyce Robertson documented the short-term effects of separation beautifully. And quite distressingly too, in a series of films made in the 1950s and the 1960s of young children that were separated from their mothers for hospital stays or other reasons. They identified 3 stages of short-term separation response. You can see them here in the diagram. Protest, which is the first stage. That's the intense crying, the searching behaviour, the calling for the caregiver. The infant is actively and desperately trying to locate and reunite with the attachment figure. Then you have despair, the second stage. This is the protest subsiding into a quieter, more withdrawn state. The infant appears low in energy, sad, disengaged. They've not accepted the separation that's occurred. They've simply exhausted their protest response. And then finally, detachment, the third stage. You see, if separation continues, the infant may appear to become indifferent to the caregiver. They stop crying when the caregiver is mentioned. They may even appear cheerful with other caregivers, and this apparent recovery is actually the most worrying stage, because the infant is beginning to detach from the attachment bond itself as a protective psychological response. Now, Robertson and Robertson also demonstrated that these effects could be significantly mitigated when separated children were provided with high-quality substitute emotional care. And that's a finding which challenged Bowlby's more pessimistic view of separation's inevitable consequences. Now, Bowlby predicted that deprivation during the critical period could lead to intellectual retardation, delinquency, depression, and affectionless psychopathy in later life. And these are severe predicted consequences, and they generated enormous research interest and significant challenge, as we will see in the next few slides. So let's have a look at the supporting evidence. There are 3 lines of support. Bowlby drew on evidence from multiple sources to support his theory. And here I've got the 3 most important ones. Let's look at the first, Lorenz. The imprinting studies we covered in the last video provided Bowlby with support for the critical period concept. If geese have a biologically determined window within which attachment-like bonding must occur, or the capacity is lost, this suggests that critical periods for attachment formation may be a general biological phenomena not specific to any one species. And Bowlby used this cross-species evidence to argue that the human critical period for attachment has a similar biological basis. Now, the limitation of this analogy, which is worth flagging in evaluation, is that imprinting in birds is a much more rigid, all-or-nothing process than attachment in humans. The mechanisms are not directly comparable, and generalizing from goslings to human infants involves a significant inferential leap. The second supporting evidence was Harlow. The rhesus monkey deprivation studies provided more direct evidence. Monkeys raised in isolation during the first months of life, deprived of normal attachment experience, showed severely disturbed social, sexual, and parenting behaviour in adulthood. They were aggressive, socially inept, and when they had their own infants, many were neglectful or abusive mothers. Now, this is powerful evidence that early attachment deprivation has long-term consequences for social development. The limitation, again, is generalizability. Rhesus monkey development is not identical to human development, and the extreme conditions of Harlow's isolation studies do not map neatly onto the kinds of deprivation that Bowlby was concerned with. The third study of supporting evidence is the Romanian orphan studies. It's the most powerful real-world evidence which comes from studies of children raised in Romanian orphanages under the Ceausescu regime, where severe understaffing meant infants received almost no personal emotional care. Many of those children were subsequently adopted by British families, and their developmental outcomes were tracked by Michael Rutter and colleagues over many years. Children adopted before the age of 6 months showed remarkable recovery. By age 4, their development was largely indistinguishable from non-institutionalized controls. Children adopted after 6 months showed more lasting effects: lower IQ scores, social difficulties, attachment problems. Children that were adopted after the age of 2 years old showed the most significant and persistent difficulties. And this study is important for 2 reasons. It provides strong evidence for Bowlby's claim that early institutional deprivation has serious developmental consequences. But it also provides evidence against his claim that effects are inevitably irreversible. The early adopted children showed substantial recovery, suggesting that sensitive subsequent care can ameliorate the effects of early deprivation. Now, AQA students should note that the Romanian orphan studies, specifically the English and Romanian adoptees project, are explicitly named on your AQA specification. So let's turn to Rutter's critique, the debate, criticisms and challenges. The most important and most comprehensive challenge to Bowlby's theory came from Michael Rutter, whose 1981 book Maternal Deprivation Reassessed thematically reviewed the evidence and identified multiple problems with Bowlby's original claims. Now here I identify Rutter's 3 main lines of criticism clearly. Deprivation versus privation. So Michael Rutter argued that Bowlby consistently conflated 2 fundamentally different experiences. Much of the evidence that Bowlby cited, including the Romanian orphan cases and many of the delinquent children in his own clinical work, actually involved privation rather than deprivation. Children who had never formed a primary attachment were being described as if they had formed one and then lost it. Since these are different experiences, they may have different causes, different mechanisms and different consequences. Rutter argued that many of the most severe outcomes Bowlby attributed to deprivation were actually the consequences of privation, and that privation is both harder to reverse and less common than Bowlby implied. Second, we have multiple attachments. Bowlby's emphasis on one primary attachment figure, monotropy, was challenged by research showing that infants routinely form meaningful attachments to multiple caregivers simultaneously. Schaeffer and Emerson's 1964 study of Scottish infants found that by 18 months most had formed multiple attachments, and that the intensity of attachment to the father and other caregivers was often comparable to attachment to the mother. The primary attachment figure is important, but not uniquely irreplaceably, so that in the way that Bowlby argued in his study. And then we have reversibility. Bowlby's claim that effects of early deprivation were largely irreversible was directly challenged by the Romanian orphan evidence we covered previously, and by subsequent research also showing that sensitive, responsive care following a period of deprivation can support significant developmental recovery. You see, the internal working model can be revised. This doesn't mean early experience is unimportant, but it does mean the system is more plastic and recoverable than Bowlby suggested. So, the sensitive period revision here Rutter and subsequent researchers have argued that the evidence better supports the concept of this sensitive period rather than a critical period, and I highlighted this earlier in this lecture. A sensitive period is a window during which development occurs most easily, during which the individual is most biologically responsive to relevant environmental input. But it is not an absolute biological cutoff after which development is impossible. This is a more nuanced and more empirically supported position than Bowlby's original critical period claim. So let's turn to some evaluation and consolidate this evaluation. And I want to develop here beyond the summary. The first and most practically significant strength is Bowlby's influence on childcare policy. Before Bowlby's work, it was standard practice in British hospitals to restrict parental visiting of hospitalised children, often to 1 hour per week or less. And the belief was that visits from parents upset children and disrupt clinical care. Bowlby's work and Robertson's films documenting the distress of hospitalised children directly challenged this policy. And by the 1960s, hospital visiting policies were being reformed and parents were being encouraged to stay with their children. And similarly, adoption practices changed. Before Bowlby, adopted children was sometimes kept in residential nurseries for months before placement, to be assessed and prepared. Bowlby's work made clear that delaying placement extended the period of privation, exactly what was most damaging. Early placement became standard practice. And these are real, measurable changes to the lives of real children. The practical impact of Bowlby's theory is one of the most compelling strengths. And the cross-species evidence from Lorenz and Harlow lends biological plausibility to the theory. The consistency of attachment-like phenomena across species suggests a genuine evolutionary basis for the critical period concept. And the internal working model concept has generated an enormous and productive research program. Adult attachment theory, examining how early attachment patterns manifest in adult romantic relationships, is one of the most active areas in contemporary psychology, and it grows directly from Bowlby's internal working model concept. So what about the weaknesses? Well, the 44 Juvenile Thieves study has serious methodological limitations that I've identified clearly. It relied on retrospective self-report data, asking people to recall events from early childhood, which is subject to memory distortion and recall bias. It was correlational. Even if early deprivation and later delinquency are associated, this doesn't establish that one caused the other. There may be confounding variables, poverty, family instability, parental mental health, that explain both the early deprivation and the later delinquency without one causing the other. And Bowlby conducted the assessments himself, knowing which group participants were in, which is a significant source of potential researcher bias. The conflation of deprivation and privation is perhaps also the most fundamental theoretical weakness. As Rutter demonstrated, treating these as equivalents undermines the explanatory precision of the entire framework. And the overemphasis on the mother has been criticised on both empirical and ideological grounds. Empirically, Schaffer and Emerson showed that fathers and other caregivers can be equally significant primary attachment figures. Ideologically, the focus on maternal care created significant social pressure on women. The implication that working mothers were damaging their children had consequences for women's participation in the workforce that Bowlby didn't intend, but that his language ended up facilitating. So strong evaluation often balances Bowlby's influence against the limits of his evidence and his definitions. So here we turn to some finally exam technique. There are 4 exam skills I want to highlight here, 4 specific pieces of guidance, and I want to develop each one into something you can apply directly in the exam room. going to bring all of them up for you to take some notes on. So AO1, first of all, requires precise definitions. The 5 key terms for this topic are monotropy, critical period, internal working model, deprivation, and privation. And you need precise, clean one-sentence definitions for each. So here they are. For monotropy, you would say the infant's biological drive to form one primary attachment that is qualitatively more important than all others. For critical period, you would say the biologically determined window from birth to approximately 2.5 years during which the primary attachment must form. For internal working model, IWM, you would write a mental representation of the self, the caregiver, and the relationship between them, built through early attachment and acting as a template for later relationships. For deprivation, you would write the loss of an existing attachment bond. For privation, you would write the failure to form an attachment bond in the first place. Learn those 5 definitions precisely because they are the AO1 foundation of every question on this topic. Secondly, use the 44 Thieves study. The study works both as an AO1, describing the aim, the sample, the method, and the 86% finding, and also as an AO3 evaluation of its own limitations. Don't just name it, state the aim, the sample size, the method, and the key finding. Then evaluate it. Retrospective data, correlational design, researcher bias. Use that sequence. Deliver it fluently because it's worth significant marks. Thirdly, use Rutter as an AO3. At the bottom, there's some ideas, phrasing. However, Rutter criticised Bowlby's theory, arguing that. And then you develop that specific criticism. The deprivation-privation distinction is the most powerful one. The reversibility argument from the Romanian Orphans is the second most powerful one. Use both of them where your mark allocations will allow. And avoid mistakes. The critical versus the sensitive period. This is the mistake, which is a frequent error. Bowlby used the language of a critical period, a fixed biological window. Later evidence and theorists, including Rutter, support a sensitive period, where development is most easily achieved during that window, but isn't impossible outside of it. Make sure you know the difference and use it in your evaluation. And finally, link to Ainsworth. This is the synoptic point which separates good answers from outstanding ones. Bowlby's theory predicts that the quality of early attachment captured through the internal working model will predict the quality of later relationships. Ainsworth's strange situation gave us a way to classify attachment quality. Now, the continuity hypothesis predicts that secure infants will go on to have more positive relationships in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. If you can make this connection explicitly, you will be demonstrating the kind of integrated understanding that all of the exam boards reward at the highest levels. So this is Bowlby's monotropic theory and maternal deprivation hypothesis, fully decoded. We've now covered in 5 videos Milgram, the multi-store model, the working memory model, Ainsworth, and Bowlby. You've got the 2 major social influence topics and full attachment cluster. In the next video, we move to conformity, Asch's line study, and the types and explanations of conformity. A completely different topic, and one that connects back to the first video's coverage of Milgram in some important ways. So subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you there.